The Old Testament reading lands us in the middle of the Joseph story. To recap, Joseph was Jacob's favourite son. And this favouritism, you may recall, incited such jealousy in Joseph's brothers that they planned to murder him. But at the very last moment they changed their minds and sold him into slavery. 2 decades later, we find Joseph as second in command to Pharaoh. In that time, Joseph rode the roller coaster of family rejection to slavery, to a favoured position in his master's household, to an unjust accusation of sexual harassment, to lying forgotten in prison for years, to release and gaining the favour of Pharaoh, to his ultimate rise to power and authority over all Egypt. Joseph isn't an attractive character, but I'm actually very grateful for his story. Like me, you may have experienced broken relationships, jealousy, even hatred. And our journey with God isn't a straightforward process. For many of us, it often seems like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And we're left questioning our value in God's scheme of things. Yet, through it all, God somehow still works through us. This may surprise us. But the good news is that God uses people like Joseph and his forebears and people like you and me to fulfill the divine purposes. There are times when life gets so dark that we may wonder whether God has forgotten us. That's how it was for Joseph. He was incarcerated for something he didn't do, and no one wanted to know him. But one thing sustained him throughout. As the ancient narrator puts it, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love." That's been my experience. Times when all I've had to hold on to is knowing that God's steadfast love is somehow present. It's the bottom line of faith. It doesn't guarantee us an easy ride. The journey is still painful, as Joseph discovered. Joseph's story involved deception, loss, and suffering. And somehow through it all, he found God was faithfully present. He came to recognize God not as the creator of these circumstances, but the weaver, taking every piece of his life, good and bad, and creating out of them something that could be used in God's purposes. That's why this story is a gift. It tells us that God embraces every element of our lives, weaving them together and somehow bringing new life out of deathly experiences, creating out of flawed beings something that reflects God's own self. The point in the story that we reach today finds Joseph as second in command in all of Egypt. Joseph had interpreted a dream the Pharaoh had had, predicting 7 years of abundance and 7 years of scarcity. And then he had put into place a system of production, storage, and distribution so that the country could survive the famine. Meanwhile, people in other regions were also suffering, including Canaan, where Joseph's father Jacob lived with his family. Word reached Jacob that there was grain to be had in Egypt, and as the family were desperate for food, Jacob decided to send his sons to Egypt to see if they could buy some. However, he held back his youngest, Benjamin, for Benjamin was the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob was still grieving the loss of Joseph. No way would Jacob let Benjamin out of his sight. Well, the brothers present themselves to the great overseer of Egypt, having no idea that this all-powerful man is the boy they had sold into slavery. The scene portrayed in today's reading is when Joseph reveals his identity and the brothers are reconciled. It's a moving scene, as reconciliation scenes often are, but as so often, there's more to it. What does it take to forgive someone for hating you, for hurting you, for lying about you, and in doing that, hurting others whom you love? Forgiveness, to hear Jesus talk, is at the heart of what it means to be a follower of his. So what does it take? Forgiveness is an option, though not one, if we're to believe the media, that people often take. When a family forgives a convicted criminal, it's considered newsworthy. It seems to me that we're more often than not encouraged to continue to play the victim and nurture our resentment or sense of injustice. For sure, Jacob now has all the power. He could throw the lot of them into jail, torture them, and teach them a lesson. However, he chooses to forgive. Still, he requires some sense that his brothers have truly repented of what they had done to him. Now, that seems reasonable. It's far easier to forgive someone when you can see that they're really sorry. So Joseph tests them. Without letting them know his true identity, he demands that they produce Benjamin. Then he lays a trap by having a valuable cup hidden in Benjamin's luggage. And when Benjamin is caught red-handed, Joseph watches to see how his brothers handle the situation. Will they again punish a favourite son? Will they cut and run, leaving Benjamin to fend for himself? Will they concoct yet another story to account for a brother's absence? Will they break their father's heart again? They don't. Instead, they plead for their brother. They tell Joseph about their old father back home, whose heart they can't bear to break. Judah even offers himself as a ransom in Benjamin's place. Joseph sees their remorse. He sees their willingness to protect the youngest, even at the cost of their own freedom. We usually require some sense that our forgiveness isn't being squandered. It's a very human response, though it misses the point. The truth about forgiveness is that we need to forgive for our own sake, even more than we need to forgive for the sake of the other person. Bitterness and resentment damage us more than the other person. It creates a prison with us locked inside. When we're finally able to forgive, we step out into the fresh air of inner freedom. Joseph sets up his tests to see whether his brothers should be forgiven. But the truth is, Joseph needs to forgive his brothers for his own sake. He needs to step out of his prison. I am your brother Joseph. And he wept loudly. No one is more relieved than Joseph. He can now see how God has worked through his life. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Later he will say, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing today. Joseph isn't attributing his brothers' actions to God. They're responsible for what they did. But God was able to use those actions for God's own purposes. The brothers devised evil, but God turned it to good. God didn't intend the harm that came to Joseph. Rather, God's good intentions for us have the potential to be more powerful than our bad intentions towards one another. God takes the broken fragments of our lives and crafts a beautiful mosaic. Joseph's story is one of both challenge and hope. Challenge in that it reminds us that forgiveness and healing are part of our calling as God's people. It's at the heart of who God is. And when we offer forgiveness and healing, we reflect something of God. The hope is that these things can happen in even the most scarred and painful situations. We can move out of the dark prisons of pain, not by burying the hurt, but by facing it and choosing to both forgive and accept forgiveness. I wonder, what does that mean for you today? Take time now just to be still and to allow Joseph's story to connect with your story.